next presentation is actually a co-workers applying for a new researcher award. And we have Dr. Sandrine Zerbib and Dr. Finan. Dr. Zerbib received her PhD from the University of California in Irvine and joined us at St. Cloud State University in 2006. Dr. Finan received her PhD from Iowa State University, which is a very fantastic university. I also received my PhD from in sociology and joined the St. Cloud State University in 2009.
Okay, so Sandrine and I are collaborating on this one, and we're going to sort of tag team as we go through. We are sort of, I don't know, we're several months into a new project looking at new immigrant women farmers in Minnesota. And you know, on the surface, that sounds like it is a really, really specific population. Not just immigrants, not just farmers, not just women, but you know, what are there? 3 of those people in Minnesota? Turns out there's a lot more than one might think about if you haven't thought about these questions before. If you think about our image of a farmer, though, in the United States, we often have, you know, our standard image of probably a man. Majority farmers, vast majority are white in the United States. We think about, you know, especially in the Midwest, you know, several hundred, several thousand maybe acres. So we're talking about a population that really challenges our understanding of what farming is in the U.S. and especially in the Midwest. Sandrine and I are both sociologists, and some of our interesting theoretical questions include this idea of intersectionality. You want to talk about intersectionality?
The idea of intersectionality is that we would learn something more that we would if we just focused on, you know, the gender aspects, gender issues, or the fact that this is a population that is farming, the fact that they are immigrants, because what happens is those women are all of those things at once, which means that they experience certain things in a different way. And so the idea is that there will be something unique and specific about how immigration issues and gender issues and, you know, the type of work they do will somehow intersect and give us more information. So this is kind of our focus, and we're basically talking about all these things through their experiences.
And you'll see that last category, class and wealth level. It probably won't surprise anyone in this room that our new immigrants in Minnesota and across the country tend to have less wealth and income than the average in the United States. And when we say new immigrant, that's probably worth defining. We're talking about our third wave immigration starting in sort of the post-World War II era, and so it might be 1 or 2 or in some cases even 3 generations, although it's more first and second generation that we're looking at. But that's our definition of new immigrant. So if we look at how farmers' populations have changed in the U.S. over time, over many, many decades, we have seen a decline in farmers. And it was just the very most recent U.S. Census of Agriculture that showed a slight increase in numbers of farmers. We're just under 2 million farmers in the United States. And one of my favorite statistics is that is slightly lower than our number of inmates in our federal prisons. So we have fewer farmers than inmates. But in 2009, the Census of Agriculture showed a 4% increase. And this is pretty exciting for those of us who look at farming in the U.S. and surprising. One of the major characteristics in that increase in farmers is that those are in small-scale agriculture. Okay, so the way that the Census of Agriculture defines farm is very so you can have a very small farm and be counted in that census of agriculture. And so we continue to see this bifurcation of American agriculture into a few very large firms and many, many, many very small enterprises. And those small enterprises might be families who are making all of their living on their land, but it could also be people where one spouse is maybe doing the farming, or maybe they sort of do farming in the evening after they both come home from a 40-hour off-farm job, and then maybe they market at the farmer's market, or they sell to local restaurants. So it's a very, very diverse group of farmers. And that change is a fairly dramatic one in our history of agriculture in the U.S. Another driver in that increase in small-scale farming is an interest, a growing interest in sort of a sustainable, environmentally sustainable types of farming, and that theme will come back as we go through. So when we look at new farmers in the U.S., we see, if we look at sort of our population of older farmers in terms of established farmers, and then newer farmers, women farmers have increased by almost 30% in the last decade or so. That's a fairly large finding. Most primary, most people who self-identify as farmer, about 80% still are men, but our proportion of women is increasing. And we also see farmers of color, all minority farmers, increasing as well. For example, Hispanic operators grew by 10%. American Indian, Asian, and Black farm operators also increased. And the Census of Agriculture, unfortunately, doesn't do a great job of tracking non-native born farmers, in part because, statistically speaking, there's not a huge number. But from other sources, we know that a lot of these new farmers of color are indeed new immigrant farmers, especially here in the Midwest. So our new farmers, this is a picture of a Hmong farmer in one of the programs of a Minnesota organization oriented toward sort of helping new immigrants gain the skills to do farming in Minnesota, called Minnesota Food Association. New farms, when we look at them across the board, regardless of immigrant or native status or ethnicity or gender, newer farms tend to have a more diversified production, so they grow more different kinds of crops, or they have more different kinds of animals. That's usually, not always, but oftentimes associated with a more environmentally sustainable way of producing. They have fewer acres, so they're cropping less land, lower sales, and younger operators, many of whom also work off-farm. And that working off-farm, having another source of income, I'm going to use the word pluriactivity as we go through here, and so if I forget to redefine that, that just means that you have a job in addition to your farming. And we have seen a dramatic growth in organic or sustainable and value-added production in those small-scale farms. So if you think about our increase in farmers markets across the country, a lot of those producers are in this small, the new farmer category in CSAs, community-supported agriculture, a new interest in sort of the local, the organic, the sustainable. It's also embodied in a lot of these new farmers. And like I said before, there are many more small farms, but it's important to not lose sight of the fact that the very, very large farms are also increasing sort of in that other end of sort of commodity production and in the conventional places. In Minnesota, it's really, really exciting, and I didn't quite realize this before I came to Minnesota a couple years ago, but it's kind of a hotbed for both our new immigrant farmers and the sustainable farming movement. And it's just in the last couple of years that organizations are really coming together to link those two trends. So the interest on the part of new immigrants to grow their farming operations, to access new markets, is coming at a time when sustainable farming organizations are looking to hook up with new farmers. And so there's this really interesting synergy between the new immigrant farming movement and the sustainable farming movement.
in this idea of immigrants coming, because most of the work on immigration studies was really to imagine, those men coming from other countries and taking risks, and sometimes taking their, bringing their spouse as a dependent, but really that was the center, and all the theories and all the questions were really addressing immigration as a genderless field. More recently, it became more important to actually talk about how gender plays really an important part in explaining all sorts of things. Who comes first? What are the kind of decisions that are made? That it's actually more of an issue where sometimes you have transnational families, issues about decisions that are made, issues about power, and what happens to values, gender values, when it turns out that women are more likely to get jobs than men by the time they get here. So it's becoming more and more obvious that we've left out a big part of understanding all sorts of processes with immigration. So why do women migrate? For similar reasons men do. They of course are in more segregated markets, and so the jobs that tend to be offered to women, to immigrant women, tend to be different than from immigrant men. Sometimes even if both work in a plant, it's a different type of industry. So we know that immigrant women will tend to work in the garment industry. They also do a lot of domestic work. So there's all sorts of things, and that those things depend also based on where they come from. Do women gain more or less power within their households? So that has been a really, big question in terms of, what happens in the household dynamics. And it turns out that, though overall it seems that women do benefit, if we talk specifically about US in terms of, having access to more economic resources, and also if their network, if they're well connected, they also have more power and more leverage in their relationship. But those are actually mixed findings, in the sense that there is still potentially some conflict that happens in this process, or that it's not necessarily viewed as a necessarily positive thing. In other words, that women, immigrant women don't necessarily look for the same thing that we imagine as